Morena, good morning. I'm Dr. Fenella France, Chief of the Preservation Research and Testing Division here at the Library of Congress, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here today. So, hello to one, to all, tēnā koe, tēnā koutou katoa. It's my pleasure to open today's Topics in Preservation lecture series that focuses on the history of scientific collaborations from around the world. It's great to have all of you here on site at the library, and we also have, I believe, around 50 online, so welcome to you all too. It's great to have you from various places around the nation and the world. In science, and especially in heritage science, the need to collaborate across disciplines is so important because each field can be very specific, and we need to work with others to create that holistic knowledge. I recall from my early career that learning what colleagues and other PhD students were working on and the instrumentation in their labs could often take heritage science in new and fascinating directions, and it still does. But often from other disciplines, food science, geology, you never know. And we also have a lot of fun on trade show floors when we say things like, it'd be really interesting to look at a historic manuscript with your thing, and they're like, you want to do what? We often think that we invented collaboration, but as this presentation will illustrate, people here have been working together for absolute centuries towards common goals and working to capture events at the whim of the environment and instrumentation. Like digital storage too, many copies make data safer. As we've found in preservation research, what begins as a science-based project can also quickly demand historical knowledge, and what better place to work with colleagues and with that knowledge than in libraries, archives, heritage, and academic institutions. Historical collections are spread out across institutions and face different preservation challenges for their survival, and the capacity to bring these collections together through presentations and collaborations such as this is really powerful. There are also often preservation issues and encounters in accessing materials, and many of these preservation challenges will be discussed by today's speakers. Today's presentations have a number of speakers, and in the interest of time, each presenter will include a brief background of themselves. We will have a short 15-minute break at 11 o'clock, so you can stretch your legs, and the restrooms are just outside the door, and conclude with the question and answer section just after 12:30. So if you could please hold questions till the end, that would be greatly appreciated. I will now hand over to Dr. David Johnson, who is the Professor of Disaster Management and the Director of the Joint Centre for Disaster Research at Massey University in New Zealand, Aotearoa.
Good morning all, and thank you very much for coming. It's actually quite a pleasure to be here, and this has been about 2.5 years in the making, and it started way back with some work which you'll hear about in an exhibition designed for, not that one, they'll do. An exhibition designed for a small museum, and I think the speakers following will outline that context. But at the time of that work, we rapidly discovered that this was actually the first formal collaboration between New Zealand and the US in science between the government agencies. And as we developed the museum, it extended the wider interests across our institutions. I've spent the last 30 years in disaster management, and for about the last 25 years have been working with a number of government agencies in the US, USGS, emergency management at state level, and federal agencies. So the science collaboration has been a big part of my life, and this story about from back in 1874 really is a version of what we've done as nations for the last 150 years. And about 2.5 years ago, just a casual conversations snowballed into a series of activities. So this year in New Zealand, there's been a number of initiatives developed by the US embassies to celebrate this 150-year celebration. And this is one of many events that have taken place since October. And we'll talk about the significance of October being the 150th anniversary of the arrival in New Zealand of the US expedition, but that's covered in a later talk. So just on behalf of the New Zealand contingent, thank you very much for hosting us. I do have a presentation at the end which will overview some of the last 150 years of scientific collaboration and maybe think about the next 150 years or beyond of things that we are doing, especially in more contemporary times now, about how we can foster and continue the collaboration that began a long time ago. So we'll bring up the next speaker now, which will give an overview of the work that was done back in 1874. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. It is my pleasure to be here in conjunction with all of the rest of the speakers to present the short overview of the 1874 Transit of the Venus expedition to New Zealand. This talk and the one immediately afterwards from my colleague Louise will kind of tag team. I will outline the expedition, who went, what happened, some of their experiences in the field, and then I'll pass over to Louise, who will tell the story of how we discovered the story. So part one, the expedition. As was alluded to in Professor Johnson's opening statements, this really began with the redevelopment of the Chatham Islands Museum. For those who aren't aware, and I appreciate having done this talk a few times before, we can sometimes take for granted who knows what. The Chatham Islands are an archipelago approximately 700 kilometres to the east of the South Island of New Zealand. You'll see on the map there the makeup of it with the big lagoon, the smaller Piss Island. And if you'll see in the top left corner, Port Hutt, also known as Whangaroa Harbour. Just for some geographic context, that was where the expedition went to. On the right, you'll see the redeveloped Chatham Islands Museum, which is the product of 2.5 years of redevelopment. In the same building is housed the redevelopment of the Chatham Islands Council. So this museum was being redeveloped, and part of the redevelopment, in addition to covering the very significant ecological and natural heritage of the island, was some notable events on the island. One of the tasks that incidentally fell to me was to begin scoping out the 1874 project, the 1874 expedition. Initially, it was going to be just that, just a single museum panel in this redeveloped museum. However, as later speakers will allude to, the significance of it within the history of bilateral science would become apparent. So that's the context for the museum redevelopment. Now, what about the context of 1874? An observation of the transit of Venus is unique because it observes a rare cyclical occurrence where Venus passes in front of the Sun. You'll see an image in the top right from the most recent transit of Venus in 2012. This happens on a cyclical basis where it occurs twice in an 8-year cycle, a 121-year gap, 8-year cycle, 105-year gap, 8 years, 121, 8 years, 105, so on and so forth. 1874 was the first in a two-part cycle, with the second one taking place in 1882 that Helen McCracken will later speak to. The most recent transit of Venus were in 2004 and 2012. So unless anyone in here is planning to live to 2117, and I'm going to give it my best crack, unfortunately I don't think anyone will see a transit of Venus within our lifetime. Now, in the context of 1874, there was great scientific interest across both the new states relatively new states of the United States and New Zealand, and also the European empires of the time. And that's because in 1874, the transit of Venus could be observed for the first time with modern photographic equipment. It was also significant at the time because in lieu of satellites and other space technology, the transit of Venus offered a rare opportunity to calibrate the distance between the Earth and the Sun. By observing the transit from multiple points across the world within the daylight hours that it fell, and then if you were able to know exactly where you were and pinpoint exactly the time that the transit began and the time it took to move across the face of the Sun, then through clever trigonometry that's far beyond me with a history degree, you could figure out through triangulation a ballpark figure between the Earth and the Sun. In 1769, Benjamin Franklin and others had worked on establishing a ballpark figure of approximately 150 million kilometres that has subsequently been narrowed down to, I can't remember the exact figure, but it is now a standardised unit for astronomical measurement. As such, however, this was all new in 1874, so it was all very new and exciting. 13 nations put their names forward to observe the transit, of which the United States teams that came to New Zealand were one of only several. The two United States teams were based in Queenstown, now known as a ski town in the South Island, and the Chatham Islands. As you'll see from the text on the left of the screen, this was the agreement that was forwarded to Government House Wellington from Lord Kimberley in London. At the time, New Zealand, of course, being a colony, meant that foreign policy was still dictated from London, essentially giving permission and assistance for the United States team to come to the New Zealand realm and to be assisted in whatever means they saw necessary in order to facilitate their observations. This is the reason why it had to be done in New Zealand, because this is the daylight hours for the 9th of December 1874, when the transit took place. As you can see, continental Europe and the Americas fell within the night, so they needed to be within those daylight hours, of which New Zealand and Australia, as well as parts of East Asia, happened to fit the bill. The United States teams undertook preparations right here in Washington, D.C., at the Naval Observatory near Foggy Bottom, approximately a half mile from the Lincoln Memorial. This gave them an opportunity to practice using their equipment on a moving target. It is said that an aluminium circle was created to represent the sun, and then on a small railway cart, a small black dot was drawn in front of it. This gave them the opportunity to practice both using telescopes and photographic equipment on a moving target. The men that embodied the Chatham Islands team are on the screen here. I won't speak to their entire biographic profiles. However, of particular note is team leader Edwin Smith and second assistant photographer William Rao. Their primary sources in the forms of diaries, letters, and photographs have been what we have largely used for telling the story of the 1874 expedition, and Louise will speak to these collections later. This is a group photo of them all observing, not observing the transit, but using their scientific equipment. The five of the 8 US transit teams departed from Brooklyn on the 6th of July 1874 aboard the USS Swatara. Via Bahia, Brazil, they journeyed to the southern hemisphere, dropping their teams off at various points along the way. Unfortunately, the chief photographer, Louis Seaborn, was stricken with yellow fever, and he tragically passed away in Bahia. As a result of that, first photographer Otto Bueller was promoted to chief photographer and William Rao to first assistant. Their first point of contact in New Zealand, where they dropped off the team that would then journey to Queenstown, before carrying on to Whangaroa, Port Hart, and arriving on the 19th of October 1874. This is a photo of their campsite that was set up on the shores of the bay, and this is a photo of their photographic darkroom. From this base, they took 172 astronomical readings in conjunction with the observation of the transit day. This was done by the astronomers. Meanwhile, the photographers practiced taking photographs to achieve the best balanced for the clearest possible photographs they could get. Of course, back in 1874, darkrooms was the best photographic technology available to them. However, it wasn't all science on island. They also had plenty of time for various recreational activities, something we might not do nowadays, shooting at wildlife. Some things we might do nowadays, rowing in rowboats and horse riding, and collecting fauna and flora. They stayed in contact with the mainland, so they weren't completely in isolation for their time via the ship, the Magellan Star. From this, Smith and Rao, and presumably others, but we have Smith and Rao's records, were able to send letters back to their family and friends in the United States. They also had lots of interactions with islanders, consisting of Moriori, Maori, and Pākehā visitors. Their photographic records are some of the earliest known of Chatham Islands residents and leave an important record of life on the island at the time. Here are some here from the Peerless Rockville collection. Now, unfortunately, for all of the efforts that were undertaken, the day of the transit was a little bit of a dud. Those familiar with the Chatham Islands will be aware that weather can be a little fickle, and unfortunately, despite sitting during the New Zealand summer, the day of the transit was cloudy and there was light rain. As such, only 8 photographic plates were able to be taken of the transit, and these have not been able to be tracked down. And additionally, one piece of equipment broke with nearly 20 minutes to go. Fortunately, the equipment maker, Charles Sumner Tater, was able to pull through and get the equipment going in good working order. It was visible, and it is said that they were able to see the transit. However, limited data was able to be observed from the Chatham Islands site. Fortunately for the global scientific context, other sites were more successful with their Transit of the Venus observations. However, we can see from the letters and diaries of the men that they were rather dejected with the whole experience, and the event was not much of a success in their eyes. They had a month on island after this letdown before the Swatara came and picked them up. From there, they steamed to Port Chalmers on the South Island of New Zealand and then round to Melbourne. From Melbourne, everyone bar Captain Smith headed back to the United States on steamer. Smith returned to New York via Europe, where he presented his findings both at the International Congress on the Transit of Venus before submitting his report to Congress in 1875. That is the story, in very brief, of the Chatham's trip for the Transit of Venus. Now, for the story of how we found the story, I'd like to pass over to Louise Piggin. Thank you very much.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Louise Piggin. I work as a conservation technician at Canterbury Museum in Christchurch, New Zealand. But I've also been involved as a researcher on this project since January 2021. At the beginning, most of our information about the expedition presence in New Zealand came from general mentions in astronomy papers and the official US government report that was published at the conclusion of the expedition, supplemented by some newspaper reporting at the time. I was curious to know more about the social history of the expedition and its members, their experiences of the voyage, life on the Chathams, and their feelings about journeying to a distant, isolated place. The key for me was to delve into who each of the men on the expedition were and see what primary sources they had left behind. My goal for this research was to enrich the collection of the Chatham Islands Museum for future researchers, while simultaneously making connections to overseas organisations who held relevant collections and knowledge. With a background in museums and collection management, I was very aware of the value that comes from provenance and contextualisation, particularly in terms of collections access and interpretation. We have usefully engaged with organisations at home, such as the Alexander Turnbull Library with their photographic collection, with platforms such as Papers Past to look at newspapers at the time, and investigations within the Chatham Islands Museum collection to see what material had been deposited there. Beyond these organisations and academic publications, there seems to be limited further collections within New Zealand, although there is always the possibility of further photographs or material that isn't catalogued, digitised, or recorded correctly. Here I'm going to focus on some of our field and research trips to relevant places to help contextualise our research and how we accessed overseas collections. So throughout the project, we've had a focus on sites of significance, particularly the camp and observation sites. We visited Chatham Island in January 2023 to survey Port Hutt or Whangaroa Harbour, which is now in private ownership with a forest of pine trees growing on what was called Venus Hill by the expedition. We also visited Te Raki Point with the assistance of the farm manager, who drove us across the island to the site of the Hay homestead, where the observation house was used as a schoolhouse after being left on island, which you can see in this photo here. This photo was recently discovered by a collections team member in a photo album in the Chatham Islands Museum, who recognised the distinctive shape of the building from the Alexander Turnbull Library photographs. And then while on holiday in Queenstown, I also located the historic reserve where the Queenstown observation site was, which is now behind a hotel, where a small area has been reserved to recognise the site where the Queenstown party observed their transit. So thanks to the powers of the internet, I managed to discover several collections in the US, including the Charles Sumner Tainter memoirs at the National Museum of American History, who were able to actually send those through totally digitally. These were accessible. And then there was several other collections in a few other places. I formed relationships with various curators and collection managers over email, and we managed to line up 3 researcher access sessions in May 2023. While the collections teams were incredibly responsive and useful, very little was available online or electronically, and there was limited scope for the digitisation of entire collections. The first visit we made was to a collection relating to William H. Rao, cared for by the Library Company of Philadelphia. In the 1990s, the library, Sarah might correct this later, the library acquired approximately 100 lantern slides, letters, and Rao's diary from 1874 to 1875. We were the first New Zealanders to view this collection and have spent 2 days in the research access room working with the senior curator who I'd been corresponding with via email since February 2022. Here we were able to view an extensive collection of lantern slides, photograph and transcribe a number of letters and diary entries, and speak to staff about Rao's life after he returned home from this trip, later becoming known for his photography of the railroad. We were able to explain our research and its significance and share our transcriptions of letters and diaries in their collection, which they had not had the resourcing to do, and discuss possibilities of a collaborative event in 2024. We then travelled to Maryland to visit Peerless Rockville, which is a community historical organisation 30 minutes north of Washington, D.C. Here we met Kathy, who was thrilled to host us all the way from New Zealand. I had discovered Peerless Rockville when delving into the personal history of Edwin Smith, the expedition leader, through a pamphlet that this organisation had published about a local history trail in the town which visited the Edwin Smith house. My goal was to find photographs of the 5 men at other life stages to corroborate my identification of them in the 1874 to 1875 images. Kathy responded with much excitement and filled me in on the Smith family, who had settled in Rockville with their house becoming a notable historic property, and she was able to identify Smith in our Chatham Island photographs. During our visit, Kathy pulled out the entire collection for us to look at, which had been passed down through the family and donated to Peerless Rockville. Edwin Smith had kept many mementos of his trip as a 21-year-old, which included images, letters, and diary entries, as well as items from his return trip in 1882 to Auckland, which included invitations to receptions across Auckland. With Kathy enriching our knowledge of Smith's life post-expedition, we were able to fill her in on the expedition to Aotearoa, New Zealand, of which they knew very little. We were able to identify people and places in the photographs, which added strength to their collection. Kathy stayed in touch, sending through new discoveries of relevance, and we continued to theorize who was who in photographs, and they discovered this photograph, which we think is the only one currently located, a formal photograph that they took after their trip in Australia. Our final visit, and one we were in anticipation of, was to the United States Naval Observatory Archive and Library. I had been in contact with the archivist for a few months and had to pre-arrange prior security clearance due to it being a US military base and also neighbours the Vice President's residence. They were incredibly accommodating and gave us a tour of the grounds and other buildings, taking us to see the telescopes and other equipment from 1874. This organisation holds all of the original items from the USA 1874 expeditions worldwide, with documentation for Chatham Island, Queenstown, but also for Nagasaki and Hobart Town, to name a few. This was a real highlight, seeing the personalised boxes for each location with documents such as provisions lists, maps, and surveys of the camp, and handwritten observations with their accompanying handwritten duplicates. The team have continued to provide support through targeted digitisation of materials such as maps and photographs, and I've been able to send back some information and updated photos of the Queenstown Historic Reserve. I think the key to the success of this research has been the increasing efforts of organisations to have digitally accessible collections. Even if there isn't the resourcing to digitise entire collections, effort has been put into creating online finding aid documents which help researchers to determine the relevance of collections. Collections online initiatives, digitisation services, and accessibility of public records and newspapers have all contributed to locating relevant collections overseas, which previously would have been very difficult to find. The relationships with the members of the heritage organisations have been fantastic to develop, and without their support and ongoing care of their collections, much of our progress wouldn't have happened. The engagement of smaller organisations such as Peerless Rockville has been inspiring, particularly as our project was born out of engagement with the Chatham Islands Museum, another smaller, regionally focused space. It's clear sector-wide and internationally that resourcing is a real issue, so I look forward to being able to deposit this research resources, and organisation contacts with the Chatham Islands Museum and community, where it can be utilised by future researchers or islanders interested in delving further into this part of the island's history. The ongoing sharing of information and digitised collections, often without a charge, has continued the spirit of collaboration and sharing of knowledge. And having a broader focus on this research as marking an event which began a 150-year relationship between two nations has allowed for us to be collaborative, broad-reaching and inclusive, which has culminated in a project that showcases an interesting part of New Zealand and Chatham Island history. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Helen McCracken. I am, in my normal day job, I work for the Ministry for Culture and Heritage in New Zealand as a lead advisor to our Māori Crown Relations Deputy Secretary. In my other hat, I'm actually also a PhD student with David as my supervisor. And David dragged me along to the Chathams and got me interested in this project. And one of the things that I have been doing is looking not necessarily in the Chathams, but in some of the observation places that happened in 1882, one of which was in Wellington, not far from where I live, and in an area which the Ministry for Culture and Heritage is responsible for. Pukeahu, our National War Memorial, was the location of the 1882 transit in Wellington observation. But today I'm looking at the observation that was undertaken by the American Party when they returned in 1882. So as we know, the opportunity, and as Josh has pointed out, the opportunity to observe a transit of Venus is a rare opportunity. Transits of Venus take place in pairs 8 years apart. In December, followed by a gap of 121 years before another pair occurs 8 years apart in June, followed by another gap of 105 years. With 1882 being the last transit observation that could be made for more than a century, and considering that this transit would be visible over a wider area of the Earth, many countries again jumped at the opportunity to undertake a second round of observations from various vantage points around the world, including the United States. As had occurred in 1874, the 1882 US government Transit of Venus operations were carried out under the United States Transit of Venus Commission. Congress set aside the sum of $75,000 for 8 parties to be formed. Of the 8, 4 remained in the United States, Washington DC, Florida, Texas and New Mexico, and 4 went to the Southern Hemisphere, South Africa, Patagonia, Chile and New Zealand. Early in September 1882, the New Zealand government again received word from Lord Kimberley, the Secretary of State for the Colonies of the United Kingdom, of the intention of an American party to come to New Zealand to observe the transit of Venus, and was requested to provide facilities so that they could undertake their work. The New Zealand expedition was to be led by Edwin Smith, who we have met prior to on the Chathams. Edwin Smith was of the United States Coast Guard and who took the role of the chief astronomer, along with Professor Henry Smith Pritchard, who's pictured here, Professor of Mathematics and Astronomy at Washington University, St. Louis, as the assistant astronomer. 2 photographers, Augustus Story and Gustav Thiekiel, were also included in the party. Smith's team left San Francisco on 19 September 1882 on the mail steamer the Australia and arrived in Auckland on the 15th of October. On their arrival, the US party received the permission of the authorities in Auckland to establish a station on the Domain to the east of the city. So that little arrow there points to a big gap on the slide. Points to the Domain, and in the corner there was where the Transit of Venus party set themselves up. And the insert is the current Domain as we see it now, which has got the Auckland Museum, and just to the left of the Auckland Museum was where the transit site was located. The Domain, which is also known as Pukekawa, is one of the oldest and one of the largest parks in Auckland. Extending 75 hectares, it is centred on the cone of an extinct volcano. At the time the party arrived in Auckland, the chosen area had been known as Weather Gauge Hill, which was the highest point and at the rear of the domain. With the assistance of the New Zealand's Assistant Surveyor General S. Percy Smith, the site was surveyed on the 20th of October 1882 and connected to the New Zealand Trigonometrical Survey. And these are the notes of that surveying. Then Mr. Connolly was employed to construct 4 buildings for the party. The first was for the transit instruments, the second for the photographic apparatus, the third was an octagon building with a revolving top, and the fourth, a storeroom. There are actually no pictures that I know of that are remaining of those images of that site. From very early on, the Commission decided to rely on the photographic method for observation. At the beginning of 1882, the instruments used in the 1874 expeditions were examined and repaired and the new instruments purchased. On reaching Auckland, the equipment was set up within an enclosure near an 1860s blockhouse, which was also commandeered for the scientific observations. Now, this is not the blockhouse. It was demolished many, many years ago in the 1890s. This is actually the Onehunga blockhouse, which was built at the same time and would have been very similar to the one where the expedition based its observations. As a connection to America, they're actually based on the American 18th century timber blockhouse examples. But of course, this was done in brick and built in about the 1860s. Amongst the instruments in the blockhouse was a telegraphic instrument which Smith used to exchange signals with Colonel Tupman, who was the head of the British expedition located at Burnham in the South Island. These signals were exchanged over a period of nights to fix longitude as exactly as possible. And I want to divert a little bit from this because the 1882 expedition also had the advantage of the telegraph in the way that the 1874 expedition did not. So prior to 1868, provincial centres in New Zealand maintained their own time based on their longitude. In September 1868, the laying of a telegraph cable across the Cook Strait, that's between the two North and South Island of New Zealand, extended the telegraph network to Napier on the east coast of the North Island and Bluff at the bottom of the South Island. This enabled the government to implement a uniform New Zealand time, making the country one of the first jurisdictions in the world to implement a legal standard time nationwide. During the 1874 observations, the telegraph signals were exchanged across the country, although not, of course, with the Chatham Islands. In 1876, a telegraph cable was laid from Sydney to Cable Bay, which is the insert in the lower picture in the slide, in Nelson in the South Island. This meant that by the 1882 transit, observers in New Zealand could establish longitude by exchanging signals with Sydney, and also which would then go right around the world to Greenwich, thus enabling a far more accurate measurement of the transit. The 1882 transit was also different from the 1874 transit in that there was a limited opportunity to view the transit, with it occurring at dawn. On the morning of the 7th of December, a considerable number of people gathered outside the enclosure in the domain, and according to the newspaper reports, seemed to take great interest in watching the various observations. The photographers were able to obtain 72 photographs before further clouds caused these operations to be suspended until just before the third contact, when 2 final images were exposed. Smith and Pritchett also successfully timed both egress contacts with the 12-centimetre refractor and a smaller unspecified telescope. These were not the only observations in New Zealand, of course, and actually in the enclosure at the invitation of the Americans was John Torrens Stevenson, an amateur astronomer, who had his own telescope and had received instructions from Tupman at Burnham. The New Zealand government also set up national observation stations near New Plymouth, Martinborough, Clyde and Wellington, and there were also several unofficial observations across the country. In addition to the observations of the transit of Venus, Smith also undertook an experiment to determine the gravity at Auckland, the force of gravity at Auckland. using pendulums. So the pendulum was one of a number that had been sent by the Royal Astronomical Society in England to the Superintendent of the United States, the Coastal Survey, for this purpose. It involved taking the 3 pendulums situated in the blockhouse, which were swung continuously from November 27 to December 4th. After the completion of the work, the photographs of the transit were sent back to America by the next outward steamer, as well as a copy on the following steamer. I think the photographers went with the photographs, and then Edwin Smith, and Pritchard then continued on to Singapore, Hong Kong, and Tokyo to continue measuring gravity in those places. Despite some limitations, the observations for the 1882 transit were a success across the country. Global observations of the 1882 transit were combined to calculate the distance from the Earth to the Sun as 92,560,000 miles. This is remarkably close to our modern-day measurement of 92,955,807.3 miles, or 1 astronomical unit. So what happened to the site afterwards? And I'm sorry if you're in the back and you can't see this, but this is a plan from the Auckland Domain in 1890, sorry. And there's a very faint, you'll see the blockhouse and the marking of the transit house. It became a feature in the landscape for Auckland City for many years. It was initially marked with a stone and surrounded by a picket fence, and at some point a pillar of the obelisk an obelisk was erected. The area also became known as Observation Hill. And as I said, the blockhouse was removed sometime in the 1890s. However, the area remained popular as a site of gathering, particularly for local defence exercises. And between 1925 and 1929, we saw the construction of the Auckland War Memorial Museum adjacent to the site. The pillar was still visible in 1942 when the Domain was commandeered for a United States camp known as Camp Hale. Camp Hale was a large US force camp located in the Auckland Domain, and this is the front of the camp. That's one part of it. It was actually divided right across the Domain. This is the outer camp. 15 buildings housed 750 Army personnel between 1942 and 1944. So for those who may not know, in 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, because all of our troops were serving in the Middle East, it was felt that New Zealand was left exposed, and our Prime Minister asked Churchill for support, and Churchill asked Roosevelt, and Roosevelt finally agreed, and they sent 21,000 people Marines to Wellington, and around 29,500 Army personnel were based in Auckland, in and around Auckland. After the war, so this is probably the last times we'll see the actual transit site. On the arrow is actually pointing to the location of the transit. It's actually very faint in this aerial photo. In and around the transit are actually anti-aircraft, the remains of the anti-aircraft guns that would have protected Camp Hale. And to the side, you'll see in the photo, you'll see the huts that were part of the US Army camp were actually moved and relocated around the Domain as transit camps for returning soldiers. And they remained there for quite a long time. This is the last photo I can find of the pillar. You can actually now see in a very faint pillar is pointed to in the arrow there. And the transit camps you'll still see. After this, the pillar was actually removed for the extension of the Auckland War Memorial Museum. At the end of the observation, of the 1882 observation, the American Party left, having successfully achieved their mission, and gratefully thanked the people of Auckland for their kindness and hospitality. And the people of Auckland were similarly pleased with the outcome of the expedition, as this letter in the local paper shows. Although there is no visible marker at the site, there remains at least one tangible legacy of the expedition. In 1883, on the retirement of James McCosh Clark as Mayor of Auckland, the people of Auckland purchased one of the telescopes from the Domain Observations as a gift to the Mayor and his wife, Kate Clark. This was primarily due to Kate's enthusiasm for astronomy. It was intended that the telescope would be donated to set up an observatory in Auckland. The telescope was eventually given to Auckland University, who then lent it to the Auckland Astronomical Society, probably about the time it was established in 1923. In 1947, the Society began raising funds to build a public observatory, and 20 years later, the Auckland Observatory and Planetarium opened its doors. Today, we know this facility as the Star Dome, which provides educational experiences for school children, university students, and defence staff, primarily for celestial navigation. At the same time, the Society continues to contribute to international research, carrying forward the same passion for understanding the universe and our place in it that inspired those 19th century scientists 150 years ago. Thank you.
So if our speakers from this morning could come back, we thought since we're running a little bit early, we'd take the opportunity to open up for questions for this morning's speakers. So do we have any questions from the audience? And I'll just go down and check out online.
I must have some questions.
What I do need to explain is you've heard a number of us say Aotearoa. The Māori name for New Zealand is the land of the long white cloud. So you've heard a lot about clouds, so it's sort of, it's quite a theme in our country.
And the speakers can ask questions of each other. So we're just trying to bring the online sequence. So we've got about 10 minutes for discussions or observations. Maybe there's just, if there's any other points that you would like to make in addition to what you've said to expand out. So we really do need to keep going for 10 minutes. So I'm sure there's some other questions.
Yes, good question. I feel brave. So in your, I'm sorry. This is, I think, mainly directed to the woman in the center. I can't remember your name. I'm sorry. Louise. In your research, as you were going through the photographs, did you come across a lot of stereo views? Because I've seen some stereo views that were produced by different American teams. And I'm wondering, when you looked at, if you found those and you looked at the backs of those, were they issued by a certain company, or did you notice that like they were issued by the government, or they were actually promoted and sold on the marketplace?
I didn't actually come across too many of those. They're the double things, yeah. The only ones we actually found were in the Library Company of Philadelphia collection, which Sarah will speak to a little later. I'm not sure she'll go into it too much. We had an event in Philadelphia on Friday, and she kind of explained a lot more about Rao's career. And so because he came back to the States and became quite an established photographer, he brought all of those photographs with him, and then he kind of sold them and distributed them. I'm not sure if any of the governments, either in New Zealand or over here, actually distributed any photographs kind of officially in that way. Yeah, if that answers your question.
I could just add to what Louise said. The two stereographs that the Library Company have relating to Rao and the Transit of Venus do not say anything on the back or have any indication of a publisher, and nothing about the government at all in terms of them publishing those images. And I've seen, the library also has one other stereo that was taken in the 1874 transit by the party that went to Nagasaki, Japan. I think the photographer's name was Clark. And I also don't remember I don't think that has a publisher either, but that one I'm less sure about.
So those stereo photos were quite common at the time, and during our visit last year, I made Louise and Josh and myself go to all the second-hand shops in Philadelphia, and there were boxes and boxes of them, but we weren't able to locate any of the time. So we thought that since they might be in Philadelphia, so many hour was spent going to second-hand shops. There were literally thousands of these stereo photographs from all around the world, but actually we didn't locate them. So if anyone finds some from 1882 or 1874, we would love to see them. I've seen them come up for sale on eBay occasionally, just one or two, but they must be out there because we know they produced lots of them for sale afterwards.
Thank you for sharing. This has been a really interesting story. Are there still some questions you're looking to find the answers to about these expeditions? Or what would be the gold standard questions you still want to answer?
I'm sure there are lots. On the way over here, I have to share this, Helen and I were thinking that it's been an amazing journey, but we realized that this year is the beginning of a sequence, and the final report was in 1884, so we think the decade of scientific collaboration, so we've got probably several more years to look at. We've done a lot of detail about one of the 8 expeditions. I'm sure there's a lot more to be had. But what we found is that the social interaction was quite strong in each of the communities. So the story from the Chathams is probably paralleled in at least the 7 other US expeditions, but there were many other countries involved as well. So I'm sure there's a rich history. But if you look at the time, and maybe I'll touch on this in my last talk, it was really an important time of global collaboration. So I think there's much parallels of some of the scientific collaborations that we're seeing now at the AGU meeting that have continued from that time. So I think there are many local stories to be had.
And if I could just add, as I mentioned, I couldn't find any images of the 1882, and I am sure there will be. What I do know is that, and this is a wee challenge to the Library of Congress staff here, is that Pritchett actually had a diary, and it's actually here in the Library of Congress, of his trip from 1882, 1883 from the transit. I haven't seen that, but that's a wee challenge if you are interested. His records are actually here in the library. So.
One more question. How much collaboration did you see between the American team and the other teams that were located kind of in the same area? Because I'm looking also into the English team, and I noticed at the University of Cambridge they have, oh, is this not on? I'm sorry. At the University of Cambridge, they have a lot of photographs of the U.S. team images, and some of them are of the New Zealand photographers. So I'm just wondering how much collaboration was between those two teams, the English and American.
So there was communication quite consistently via that ship between the 2 United States teams, the one in Queenstown and the one on the Chatham Islands. Given the relative isolation of the Chatham Islands, I think it's probably fair to say that there wasn't much contact, and certainly none of the primary sources that I've looked at, I think probably have looked at, show a communication between, at least on a daily level, between any of the other New Zealand-based teams. Probably, though, when Captain Smith returned to Europe for the International Transit of Venus Congress, that would have been when all of the scientists would have had their debrief. He returned, of course, significantly later than the others to the United States, having gone via Europe. So that's probably where he would have spoken to the other team leaders from other teams.
Just one thing I will add is that the all of the places in New Zealand where the different international expedition teams were set up were all kind of relatively spread apart, and I'm not sure how good transport links were back then. But the ship that had dropped off the Americans at the Chatham Islands, it returned back to the mainland while they were there because I think they probably didn't want to, hang out there in a very isolated place. And they actually heard reports that the Germans down in one of the subantarctic islands on the Auckland Islands were having a bit of trouble. And so then the US ship actually sailed down to them to check in on them. And I think that they were all fine, so they went back. But there definitely was an awareness that there were multiple international bodies all there, and they were aware of the work that they were all doing.
So you would have heard mention that in the 1882 observation at the Domain, there was a guy called John Torrens Stevenson who was asked to be at the American observation, and he was actually working on behalf of Tupman at Burnham. I think they were also exchanging signals for longitude at Burnham. Burnham was actually giving the longitude signal for the measurement of the transit, and of course they were working to connect with Greenwich. So I think you will find that there are connections between the American and the British. But yeah, you might have to dig a little bit further on that.
So I'm curious, what I sort of alluded to in my intro, we find really often that we focus on the science, and I'm looking at some of my wonderful staff and colleagues, and then you get this amazing, I think a number of you, Louise and others, alluded to the social and the economic context that intervenes. And I'm really intrigued by how we start on one journey and then there's a side story. And Josh, you talked about all the photographs. And so I'm curious about what other types of research have come out of that aren't related to what exactly you were starting with, but potentially other research areas from the materials that you've all found. And Helen, you worked to each of this as well too. So.
Well, I think in general, my interest was my relationship with US academics in disasters and unrelated to astronomy. So what we found was that the astronomers of this world, there's been lectures about the transit of Venus and much have been written about it, but actually some of the context, so the fact that the New Zealand government we were two young nations at that time, and we were trying to, as nations, find our place in the world, as nations do. And I think if there's also a much broader, and I'm not a historian of 19th century conflict, but this was a time when actually nations came together. So they had a long history in the early 19th century of conflict, and in this period of time, many countries came together for observations. And I think there are stories of local collaboration. So the US, the connection from the Congress to nations for establishment was also with the Imperial Russia at the time, so they were in Vladivostok. It was Imperial China, they were based in Beijing, and in Imperial Nagasaki. So each of those governments would have accepted the visitations, and like New Zealand and in Australia. So a lot was happening, and a lot of it is not my area of expertise, but I think there's still more to be explored about the role of these events had in a wider context, both the context allowing what happened to happen, but also the events of coming together for essentially what was nothing to do with resources or land. This was about big science. This was how big's the universe. That was the only driving factor really behind it. So countries came along to it, and if we think in more contemporary times, some of the big science-driven, big collaborative science efforts, this was the big science of the day, and it's amazing how many countries came together. So yeah, I think there's a lot of other links and more links to explore around how it came to be. But I think what we also found is that many of these there's always a local story. And the local story that we shared when we visited your collection is about local people doing interesting things in other places and bringing that experience back home with them. So that is an important part of this.
I'll just add to that. As David alluded to, sometimes the history of science writing can be very technical, very black and white. And like I said, I come from a history background. But while the science of it has been very well canvassed, one of the really interesting things is to see that personal voice really shine through, seeing people Edwin Smith, seeing William Rao come through and see their individuals and their personalities shining through in their primary sources, that you would read if you approach it with more of a historical research lens rather than a purely scientific history lens. Hopefully I'm remembering this right from William Rao's diaries, but in one of his letters back to family, he describes himself as any self-respecting 19-year-old would, as hardy as a buck. And I think that says a lot about him. It's not just that second assistant photographer. He's sprightly 19-year-old William Rao with a lot of personality and a lot of feelings.
Online question from Chris.
This is probably mostly for Helen, but really for anyone. You mentioned that the monument was removed shortly after the war. Has there been any efforts or anything done since then to put some sort of memorial in place since then?
The site is probably now covered by the extension to the Auckland Museum. So I'd have to double check, but no, there hasn't been an effort. I do know that I've just recently heard from my colleagues in Pohiri Tonga Heritage New Zealand. They are actually going to list the site of Burnham for its observations. It's going to be listed on its site, but it could be that the interest that is gathering around the transit now, that we may see a greater interest in looking at all of those sites across the country as a collective story of that 19th century science. And just to add, one of the things that I found fascinating is how the world began to shrink with the telegraph and how people began to communicate and what that did to science, how information could be exchanged so quickly around the world, so that not only was accurate observations, but knowledge was being exchanged, and it had dramatically changed in half a century. And I think that's that I'm quite interested in, is that collapse of the world in terms of how connected everyone suddenly became. But yeah, so yeah, sorry to batch that. No, the observation site in the Auckland Domain has gone, but who knows?
I think that's so interesting too, that contextuality. I learned a lot. It's like, oh wow, is that when it's happened? I love the fact that New Zealand was the first to get the timeline. I mean, we like being first in things, right? So please join me in thanking all of our morning speakers again. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Michael O'Connor from the Naval Observatory to the podium, and I will hand over to him.
Hi everyone, my name is Mike O'Connor. I'm the archivist at the U.S. Naval Observatory, and together with our director Morgan Black and our museum specialist Alex Bullhauer, I feel really fortunate to share this historic library space. So a little bit about the observatory's history. We were founded in 1830 as the depot of charts and instruments. And part of our priorities back then were cataloging stars and rating marine chronometers for accuracy. So we would take these timepieces off ships, rate them for accuracy, and get them back on their way again on ocean-going vessels. In 1844, we were reestablished as the U.S. Naval Observatory with an expanded mission. And in the following decades, that was the 1874 Transit of Venus expeditions. And in 1877, one of our scientists, Asaph Hall, discovered the moons of Mars. 1893, we occupied our current location in Glover Park, or Georgetown Heights. This is near the British Embassy, and at that point, it was beyond the urban extent of Washington, D.C., so it made for better viewing. Our main building here was designed by Richard Morris Hunt. He designed the base of the Statue of Liberty, as well as some of the mansions up in Newport, Rhode Island. And over to the right, that rotunda structure is the library we were just looking at. And over to the left is our tower for our 12-inch telescope. Also on the USNO campus is the Vice President's residence. It was also built 1893, and it started as the superintendent's residence of the Naval Observatory, and it went up to Chief of Naval Operations, and it eventually became the Vice President's residence in the late 70s with Mondale, and it remains so today under Vice President Harris. Today, our mission is to serve as the Department of Defense's authoritative source for the position and motion of celestial bodies, the motions of the Earth, and precise time. So kind of the where and the when of navigation, those key elements. The library has 80,000 items, including 800 rare books, names like Copernicus, Newton, Galileo. Our oldest item is from 1482. There's the archives, and we have a museum as well. And this section right here is one of my favorite parts on the Arctic expeditions of the late 19th century, just a side note. In our museum is this interesting piece from the Transit of Venus expeditions. It's a 5-inch Clark telescope that was used in Chatham Islands in 1874 and again in Auckland in 1882. So this is a real highlight, and it's right down the hall from where I sit. When I talk about the Transit of Venus and give tours, I like to use the cover of this book from 1892, published in Sydney. It's kind of this beautiful Victorian illustration of a transit of Venus showing the silhouetted dot of Venus going across the surface of the sun. Joshua talked about this earlier, but yeah, it occurs in pairs. There was a pair in the 18th century. There was the 1874 and 1882 transits, and then the last one in 2004 and 2012. They are hoping to establish the distance between the Earth and the Sun, and by extension, the extent of the solar system. The U.S. Naval Observatory in response sent 8 teams total, 3 northern, 5 southern hemisphere, including Tasmania and Queenstown and Chatham Island. And we'll take a look at a few things from each of those, or the latter few sites. The products of these expeditions all came back in these custom tin boxes that were highlighted earlier. They were full of observation notebooks, photographs, correspondence, administrative material, journals, and when I started as archivist in 2020, they were all still contained in these original tin boxes. The collection still had a lot of 19th century wrapping and was in its original context. These are some observation notebooks in this 19th century paper. You can see them peeking out in the lower corner. Some of the challenges of processing the collection included just the sheer volume of materials, the fragility, interpretation of astronomical data, where I was lucky enough to use some of our veteran astronomers for help. The collection is also incomplete, so items survive from some expeditions that don't survive from others, but we can kind of cross-reference and create a full picture. One thing we're really fortunate does survive is a set of 31 photos from the Queenstown expedition. They don't survive in quite this number from the other expeditions, so I'm going to highlight a few of them. This is a thatched cottage near Halfway Bay, and we assume the 4 individuals standing around the house are members of the American expedition. This was taken in the town of Nelson, South Island, and it might not come through that clearly, but there's a large building there, and there are members of the expedition standing out in front again. A railroad bridge over the Matera River. The Ross Creek Reservoir in Dunedin. I understand this structure still survives. Okay, great. And I liked this little locomotive making its way through the woods. Unspecified location, but it's somewhere near Queenstown. And so it's kind of this context of what was going on in addition to the science that makes this collection interesting and possibly of use to someone looking into local history. Some of the admin papers that survive that are kind of interesting include lists of food supplies for the Chatham Island expedition. Some of the items, like macaroni soup, could easily be in a modern kitchen. Other things look more obscure to modern viewers. We also have the payroll receipts of the astronomers. And to the right is payment for passage on board the Swatara. And outside of the collection, we have a number of things that really shed light on the day-to-day lives of the astronomers. And this is a real highlight. It's the Leonard Waldo Journal. In addition to his scientific responsibilities, he kept a private journal that kind of shows the day in and day out human element of the expedition. He was in Hobart, Tasmania, but he makes quite a few references to what's going on in New Zealand, and we'll see an interesting reference in a second to his experience in Auckland. This is a page of his diary opened to the day of the transit, and Joshua mentioned some of the cloudiness in another site, but here as well, he awoke to find the sky heavily clouded, no apparent chance for observing the transit. And he then says a couple sentences later, some played at tossing pennies, but we all felt very blue in our disappointment. But the weather cleared just in time. They were able to catch about 40 astronomical photographs. And so then he says, we have snatched victory out of the jaws of defeat. And they go on board the ship and have a party. It says right there, we had a dinner on board the Swatara after the transit with the usual menu of wine, toasts, and stories. So that's a cool detail. December 30th in this journal, the Americans have packed up and they're going back home, and they pass through Auckland, and they give this interesting description of the town. We touched at Auckland, New Zealand for a day, a well-built, thriving little city of 20,000 on the northern coast, and he's impressed with the well-paved streets and to be greeted with the metropolitan question of cab, sir. So that was a neat detail as well. So the results of the Trans-Venus expeditions. There was the 1874 transit. 8 years later, there was the 1882 transit. Another set of teams was sent out, including to Auckland. It took years to calculate the data. There was some disagreements, changes in leadership, change in methods. But finally, in 1894, William Harkness, who was our scientific director at that point, originally a member of one of the Tasmania teams, he published a final number for the distance between the Earth and the Sun. We're now talking the dawn of the 20th century, so improving technologies meant that that this number was improved upon in the upcoming years. But in addition to the scientific output, there's the legacy of younger countries stepping forward and becoming involved in scientific endeavors, and the cooperation of the US and New Zealand. So I'd like to leave you with a neat view of DC from our historic building and our telescope tower. Just to the right of the flagpole, you can see the monument, and to the left is the Capitol. And I'd like to thank you very much, and thanks to the Massey team for putting this together.
Thank you for including me in this program commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Transit of Venus expedition and the first scientific collaboration between New Zealand and the United States. I'm going to start my presentation by telling you very briefly about the Library Company of Philadelphia. The Library Company is about to celebrate its 300th anniversary, but outside of a relatively small circle of scholars, we're not as well known as we should be. But before I move into my slides, just a quick heads up that unless the slide indicates something different, everything in my presentation is part of the Library Company's collections. The Library Company was founded by Benjamin Franklin and a group of his friends in 1731. Franklin was a 25-year-old printer who enjoyed getting together with other men in a discussion group called the Junto, where they talked about current events, politics, history, and other practical subjects. Franklin came up with the idea of everyone in the Junto contributing a certain amount of money to buy a share in what he called the Library Company. And with that pooled money, they hired someone in England to purchase books to send to Philadelphia to be shared by members of the Junto. It took about 60 years for the Library Company to build its own building, and that's what you see in this 1800 engraving by William Birch, who issued 27 views of what Birch deemed to be important sites in the city of Philadelphia. We outgrew our original building and relocated several times within the city until settling in our current building in the mid-1960s. We clearly went for a different architectural style with our mid-20th century building, but I wanted to point out one constant. The statue of Benjamin Franklin from our original building has followed us from location to location. Today, the Library Company is an independent research library with approximately 1 million books, over 125,000 graphics, and a small but distinguished collection of art and artifacts, with a focus on the Atlantic worlds from the colonial period into the early 20th century. We maintain 2 reading rooms for researchers, and in these spaces we make our collections accessible at no charge to everyone, not just scholars or Library Company members. We do offer residential fellowships to scholars, ranging from a month to an academic year, and mount exhibitions of our collections and present public programming and events. The Transit of Venus exhibition I curated entitled, "We Did Not See the Sun for a Single Moment, William Rao and His Transit of Venus Experience," is located in our hallway gallery space and will be on display until January 10th. The Library Company is fortunate to own a very strong collection of materials relating to William Rao, one of the U.S. photographers who traveled to the Chatham Islands in 1874 to document the transit of Venus. William Rao was born in Philadelphia in 1855 and spent his long photographic career with a studio in Philadelphia, and therefore clearly fits into the Library Company's interest in collecting graphics relating to the works of Philadelphia engravers, lithographers, and photographers. We probably have over 1,000 items relating to William Rao in our collection, including photographs, letters, and other pieces of ephemera. Rao material has come to the Library Company through both gifts and purchases and has been added to the collection as individual items as well as in large groups. The Rao collection grew dramatically in the 1990s, Louise was correct, when we purchased hundreds of lantern slides by him from a New Jersey photo dealer. Also in the 1990s, descendants of William Rao donated a large collection of items relating to his life and works, and we have continued to add to our holdings over the last 30 years. So the Rao material I will share with you in the next series of slides is not from one monolithic William Rao collection, but is instead pulled from all of our various holdings. These portraits of Rao show him at different stages of his life. The image on the far left was taken in 1877, only a few years after his return from the Transit of Venus trip. The image on the far right, the family photo, includes his father-in-law, William Bell, who's the man wearing a hat. William Bell was also a photographer in Philadelphia and reportedly recommended William Rao as a photographer for the Transit of Venus expedition. Later, William Bell served as a photographer for the 1882 Transit of Venus expedition. The Library Company's William Rao material documents the 40 years his Philadelphia studio was in business. He produced this advertising brochure in the early 20th century to drive business to his new studio location. Each image on the pull-out illustration illustrates a facet of his business, including a portrait studio, a mounting and finishing room, a copying room, a lantern slide making room, and a sales room. Both the brochure cover and Rao's business card includes hieroglyphics, hinting at the photographic trip he took to the Middle East in the 1880s. Rao's business card also proudly mentions the important photographic commissions he undertook for the Pennsylvania and Lehigh Valley Railroad lines to promote passenger travel. William Rao received his railroad commissions in the 1890s, but the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Lehigh Valley Railroad outfitted a special car for Rao so he could travel along the lines in some measure of comfort. This is in sharp contrast to the conditions he worked under while on the Transit of Venus expedition. The car included sleeping accommodations for Rao and space for his equipment and a dark room. In one description, Rao wrote that he hung photographs from the Transit of Venus expedition within his photographic car. The photograph on the right gives you an idea of the size of the equipment he used to take the large format photographs he produced while fulfilling the railroad commissions. As the owner of a commercial photographic studio in Philadelphia, Rao found business taking photographs of various civic events and producing images in a variety of formats. The photograph at the left shows a massive crowd attending the unveiling of a Statue of Liberty replica during a World War I Liberty Bond rally. The image in the upper right corner is a photographic postcard of a group of children at a Philadelphia orphanage. In the bottom right is a stereograph by Rao. Viewing stereographs was a very popular form of parlor entertainment in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when viewers put the card with these two almost identical photographs into a special device that made the images become three-dimensional. Here, Rao photographed spectators at a parade during the 1907 Elks Convention in Philadelphia. Many images within our William Rao holdings are in the format of a lantern slide, which is a positive image on glass meant to be projected. You may remember that a lantern slide making room was featured in Rao's business brochure. This is one of hundreds of lantern slides we have of Rao's trip to the Middle East in 1881-1882. Also within the Library Company's collections are many of Rao's writings, both published and unpublished. We have diaries that he kept during his photographic trips, letters he wrote home to family members, as well as articles that were published in 19th century photographic periodicals, such as the Philadelphia Photographer, Photographic Times, and the American Journal of Photography. Overall, William Rao is probably the photographer whose career is the best documented among all of our collections at the Library Company. Now I want to switch gears a bit and spend the rest of my allotted time this morning talking more specifically about Rao's work during the Transit of Venus expedition, as well as the work of other photographers who were with him in New Zealand and the Chatham Islands. This should look familiar to you. As I mentioned just a moment ago, William Rao kept diaries during many of his travels, starting with this one documenting his journey from the Brooklyn, New York Navy Yard to the Chatham Islands and his trip back via the Pacific Ocean. He wrote in his diary daily, writing about photography, his interactions with fellow travelers, and the scenery, both natural and man-made, he encountered during the nearly year-long trip. Rao began the Transit of Venus journey as the second assistant photographer, meaning he was the lowest ranking photographer, but after the death of one photographer during the journey, he moved up to serve as first assistant. Nonetheless, he was not in charge of deciding what official photographs would be taken or how the transit would be photographically documented. Rao's work included documenting the heliostat and other equipment necessary for observing the transit of Venus, as seen in the image on the left. He seemed particularly proud of the photographic house that he assisted in constructing on the Chatham Islands, the view on the right. On October 29, 1874, he wrote in his journal, "This morning we began immediately on our photographic house and were working on it all day. We built brick piers for supports. We were obligated to carry stones up the hill. This was a very tiresome job, but we had a wheelbarrow with ropes tied in front that we loaded with stones and pulled it up together." The main point of the expedition was to view and record a rare astronomical event, and that was difficult to do in the rainy, cloudy conditions the Chatham Islands group experienced on December 9th, the day of the transit. A few days earlier, on December 5th, Rao wrote in his diary, "It was decided that I should coat the plates, Buhler develop, Tainter expose, red level, direction of the plumb, give the telegraph signal, etc., and Mr. Scott recording. In this way, everything works very quick and good." But despite all their preparations and practice, the photographs they took, given the weather conditions, were less than spectacular. Here's one of Rao's views taken that day, and I will read some of what he dejectedly wrote in his diary. "We were standing at our positions, ready for any light clouds to take the least opportunity of getting pictures. Plates were coated, sensitized, and thrown in the bucket. Exposures made on a few, some pictures, but very poor. Fogged from slow exposure and overdeveloped. At 4:30, it began to rain. Everyone got the blues by this time." As someone who is not a scientist and knows very little about the transit of Venus from an astronomical perspective, the excitement of being part of this commemoration for me is reading and rereading Rao's diary, from what I can tease out about Rao's interactions with other photographers. Rao frequently sought out photography studios during his trip. While in Dunedin, I tried to change what I wrote, Dunedin. While in Dunedin, New Zealand, Rao recorded in his diary on January 11th, "Buhler and I walked around the town to see the sights, bought a jadestone, indigenous, went to visit a photograph gallery. Proprietor showed me all around his place." Buhler is Otto Buhler, who served as the chief photographer to the Chatham Islands group. The photograph studio is not identified by Rao by name, but is most likely that of the Burton brothers, who for nearly 50 years operated a studio just a few blocks from the monument shown here. The following day, January 12th, Rao wrote in his diary that he returned to Dunedin and, quote, "bought some photos of Maori chiefs." I don't know if he made this purchase from the Burton Brothers studio, but possibly. However, 2 months later, while visiting Auckland, Rao wrote in his diary that he had purchased more images of indigenous people, writing on March 18th, "This afternoon, Buhler, Aim, and myself took a walk up Queen Street, went to the American photo rooms, bought some photos of Maoris." The image I'm showing here is part of the William Rao collection, and the sitter is identified on the lantern slide as the Maori chief of Taranaki. Here I want to state that Rao's writings about his experience on the Transit of Venus expedition definitely reflected his belief in the superiority of white Westerners. Although he expressed curiosity about indigenous culture, he had little respect for it. On December 19th, 1874, for example, he wrote that he took a spade and went exploring Chatham Islands with fellow photographer Otto Bueller, and came back with a skull and boar's tusk that he, quote unquote, found. Rao doesn't record what Bueller found, but the American Museum of Natural History in New York City noted that on May 1st, 1875, an Otto M. Bueller donated human remains from the Chatham Islands. 2 months later, Bueller made another donation to the museum, this time of photographs of Chatham Islands taken on the Transit of Venus expedition, is how it's described. I do not know if Bueller's gifts were ever exhibited at the museum or are part of their collection still, nor do I know if Rao brought back any human remains himself. Another local photographer whom Rao visited while on the expedition was Alfred Winter, who had a studio in Hobart, Tasmania. On February 3rd, 1875, Rao recorded that he sat for several portraits at Winter's studio, including the one shown here, but was displeased with the results, describing them as very poor. Alfred Winter had operated a studio in Hobart for about 5 years at the time of Rao's visit. Rao recorded in his diary later in February that Otto Bueller sold some of his photographic equipment to Mr. Winter as the American photographers prepared to leave on their journey back home to the United States. Otto Bueller is the photographer most frequently mentioned by Rao, which makes sense since the two men worked closely together in the Chatham Islands. But Rao on a few occasions mentions a Charles Philippi, who was an American photographer stationed in Bluff Harbor, New Zealand during the transit. Online, I found a short article from the June 5th, 1875 issue of the Nelson Evening Mail that provides a little more information about Philippi and his expedition colleague, W.B. Pearson. The article reads in part, Misters Philippi and Pearson, who formed the American Photographic Party for observing the recent transit of Venus at Queenstown, Otago, have turned their visit to account by taking some beautiful views of New Zealand scenery, which are intended for the Universal Expedition at Philadelphia Exhibition. Over and over I practiced, and every time I said expedition, it is exhibition at Philadelphia in 1876. The article goes on to say that the photographers took 14 large views of Nelson, including the port, cliffs, 4 from the church hill, the college, railway works, etc. This article lets us know that some of the American photographers stayed on well past the Transit of Venus date in early December, perhaps seeking business opportunities. Rao himself had begun his journey home in March of 1875. Philippi and Pearson may have intended to exhibit their New Zealand photography at the Centennial Exhibition, but I could not find any evidence this actually happened. The 2 photographs shown here show New Zealand's display at that 1876 fair. The official catalog for the Centennial describes the New England section of the fair as being, quote, a 17-feet-long space covered with watercolored sketches and photographs of New Zealand scenery by W.M. Cooper, Denerill, Burton, McCrombie, and other artists. Charles Philippi and W.B. Pearson's photographs are not mentioned, but then I began to wonder if works by American photographers would even be in New Zealand's display. Probably not. However, I could not find that Philippi and Pearson's images were exhibited anywhere at the fair, so perhaps their plan of showcasing their New Zealand work at the Centennial never came to fruition. And now, because I was paying attention in our last presentation, I think these might be the photographs that are at the Naval Observatory, given what you showed. So, excellent. In addition to the photographs from the Chatham Islands and his photographs from his trips around the world, Rao brought home with him souvenirs, like this fan and other items he purchased that he saw as exotic, like the kangaroo fur vest he bought in Hobart. Rao gave this fan to Louise Bell, who became his wife about a year after his return from the transit. Like he did with other photographic trips, Rao published accounts in the photographic literature of his experiences based on his diaries and memories. In 1899, on the 25th anniversary of the Transit of Venus expedition, the American Journal of Photography published this article by Rao. But the way that Rao's experience reached the largest audience was through the reproduction of his photographs. This sales catalog, issued by William Rao's studio in 1894, 20 years after his Transit of Venus trip, still included about 50 images taken during his time spent in the Chatham Islands, available to anyone willing to spend 50 cents on a lantern slide. In conclusion, I will say that an area that might be worth exploring by future researchers is whether Rao and his fellow transit photographers continue to have professional and personal relationships once they return from the transit. Did ongoing ties develop between the American photographers who went on the transit expedition and the local photographers they encountered? The proprietor of the American Photographic Rooms in Auckland, for example, entrusted Rao with a letter to give to the editor of the periodical, The Philadelphia Photographer, which makes clear the worldwide influence of that periodical, something I was a bit surprised at. I'm also curious whether transit photographer John Moran, who was stationed in Hobart, and Charles Filippi, who I mentioned earlier and who was stationed in Bluff Harbor, New Zealand, had interactions with William Rao once they all returned to work as photographers in Philadelphia. These are tantalizing questions that require more of my attention before I can provide answers. And now I will thank you for your attention. We are having a question and answer period at the end of the presentation, but if you think of something that you would like to ask after today, I've included my contact information on the slide, and please feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Catherine Rogers. I am the collections manager at Peerless Rockville Historic Preservation, and I'm here to speak to you a little bit more about Edwin Smith after the Transit of Venus. Although the reason we are here is because, as you know, Louise contacted me to help identify members of the expedition, and I was thrilled to help. It was so exciting to have somebody interested in our little collection. So thank you very much, Louise. So we are Peerless Rockville Historic Preservation, a small nonprofit based in Rockville, Maryland. We were founded in 1974. We've been celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And we were founded by a group of concerned citizens. A lot of history was being lost in Rockville with modernization due to an urban development project. And they wanted to make sure that buildings and items relating to Rockville history were preserved. The collection has grown over the years. We've moved several times, but we have a collection of histories of the buildings, photographs of the buildings, personal papers from families and businesses located in Rockville. And it is open to anyone who wants to visit and research. And one of our main focuses has always been educational programming on history and heritage of Rockville. And we produce a series of lectures each year, as well as publications, walking tours, and exhibits. A question which is frequently asked, and as a matter of fact was asked just a few minutes ago, is what does Peerless Rockville mean? And this does actually connect to the Edwin Smith story, so I'm happy to have the opportunity to answer. Peerless Rockville took its name from an 1890s real estate brochure. A lawyer from Washington, D.C. named Henry Kopp purchased 500 acres to develop into a suburban neighborhood. And the area is referred to in Rockville as the West End. It is on the western side of Rockville, what was the extreme west at that time, but it is also on land which had been owned by Julius West, a farmer. So take your pick. The advertising is extolling the virtues of Rockville as a place to get away from the oppressive heat and humidity in Washington, D.C., and to this healthier country location. With the arrival of the railroads in 1873 in Rockville, it had become a popular destination for families to vacation. It was close enough to Washington that men could return to the city to do business, and families could stay on for weeks or for the entire summer. Some people enjoyed it so much that they decided to purchase summer homes there, and then later they became year-round residents. The Smiths were among those who decided to build a home in Rockville. Edwin Smith was born in New York, and when he joined the New Zealand expedition, he was in his early 20s. In 1879, he came back to the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey and became chief of the Instrument Corps. In 1885, he married a woman named Lucy Scott Black. And they spent some time in Rockville at one of the local hotels, and they liked it and decided they would like to purchase some land and build a cottage or two, one for them, one for Lucy's widowed mother. And her mother and Lucy were from New Orleans originally, and they had kind of a southern idea in mind of a little cottage with a veranda so they could enjoy the lovely breezes. But as many projects do, this one kind of grew a bit, and a little cottage turned into a 16-room house. So in 1899, the first of their children was born. Her name was Lucy. And this is the Smith family in around 1900. And in the back of the photo on the left, you can see Edwin and his son, Edwin Jr. And Lucy, their first child, is directly in front of Edwin, and she is seated next to her mother, Lucy. They weren't very creative with the names, were they? Sorry. To Lucy Sr., to Mrs. Smith's right, is their son, Theron, and, is Harold. And then to the right of Harold is Theron. And behind Theron is either Duncan or Ralph, one of the twins. And on the other side, next to Lucy and in front of their father, is either Ralph or Duncan. Do not know which is which. So this is the Smith family, and this is the home they built. The house stands on Forest Avenue at 108 Forest Avenue. And at this time, this was the very edge of the development for Rockville. You can see the dirt road in front of it. Most of Rockville was dirt roads, except for the very downtown, which had some cobbles at that time. Forest Avenue, where are the trees? Well, the trees are on the other side. We don't see them in this, but apparently Mrs. Smith actually named it Forest Avenue for the number of trees that her home looked upon. And these are from the early 1900s. The top photo, you can see some of the family standing on the lawn there. And the house next to it is the Presbyterian rector's home. So two homes on the street at that time. And this is the house current as it stands currently. It is still owned by members of the Smith family. It is listed on the Maryland Inventory of Historic Places. Locally, its claim to fame is that it was used as the location for a 1963 horror film called Lilith, starring Warren Beatty. As a matter of fact, Edwin Smith's daughter Lucy, who by that time was 73 years old, also appeared in the film as Warren Beatty's grandmother. And no, I have not seen the film, although we always mean to do that. In 1891, 1882, of course, we know that Edwin Smith returned to New Zealand to participate in the second transit of Venus. But in 1891, he was asked to assist in another international research project on studying variations in latitude. And he was asked to establish an observatory. So he chose to place that observatory in his backyard, which may seem unusual, except that we find he was not actually given any additional pay for the additional duty of establishing this this observatory and taking the readings associated with it. So I guess he decided that maybe having the observatory right next to the house was the most economical way to do this. So the observatory was still present in the early 1980s, but it was in very poor condition. There were attempts to restore it, but they were unsuccessful, and it was removed shortly after these images were taken. In 1891, Edwin Smith spent 146 nights out in this little observatory and took about 1,800 measurements in latitude. Afterwards, according to the family, it was no longer used as an observatory. It was a playhouse for the children. It was a storage shed. It was anything else you can think that a small building in your backyard might be used for. So Smith left the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey for a brief time from 1895 to 97 when he was with the New York State Land Survey. He returned to the Coast and Geodetic Survey, and in 1899, they were continuing their studies of latitude and the wobble of the Earth, and tasked Edwin Smith with constructing a new observatory. And whether they said not in your backyard or not, I don't know, but they leased a parcel of land in Gaithersburg, Maryland, which is about 12 miles north of Rockville. And he was charged with constructing that. And from October of 1899 through either October of 1900 or January of 1901, depending on which write-up you believe, he spent 187 nights at that observatory taking measurements, and the family would often come out and visit him. They would hire a bus or a cart from Rockville and drive out, and they could stay there. There was a small house he had constructed next to the observatory for the use of anyone who was using the observatory. This is a picture of Edwin Smith in about 1900. I found that he was fairly easy to identify in pictures from the 1874 expedition because he didn't change all that much. He also kept the same style hat, same hair, facial hair. He was really easy to find. This picture, and I'm sorry it's so faint, it's actually a negative that I have just turned into a positive image. It's a glass plate, and obviously it's damaged. It is taken inside the Gaithersburg Observatory in November or December of 1900. You can't see it in this image, but there is a calendar on the wall behind the right-hand lamp. And if you blow it up, it shows that it's a November-December 1900 calendar. Edwin Smith died in December 1st, 1912, and is buried in the Rockville Cemetery. But this little building is still standing today. And it is in Observatory Latitude Park in Gaithersburg, Maryland. It is a National Park Service National Historic Landmark. Although it has not been used as an observatory since the 1980s, the city of Gaithersburg does hold astronomy-related events in the park, such as stargazing. And the community park is also used for small festivals, such as Shakespeare in the Park. And in 1899, it was one of the 6 stations established internationally for the purpose of measuring variations in latitude caused by the Earth's wobble. And displayed on the walkway leading to the observatory are the names of the other latitude stations. Also in the park is the Meridian Mark Pier, which was used to calibrate the Zenith telescope, which was mounted in the observatory. And on the grounds of the park, there are 5 USGS survey monuments. They establish exact geographic longitude and latitude points, elevations above sea level, and the direction of magnetic north. The observatory RM1 monument, placed in 1966, is apparently still used today for positional testing of GPS. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed being here and enjoyed being part of this this whole event and this whole study. It was exciting to find out that there was some connection with someone on the other side of the world who wanted to know about Edwin Smith, and find out that our collection had a bigger story connected to it. Thank you. If you want to know more about Peerless Rockville, please visit our website or come visit us in Rockville. We're only a short train ride away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and just want to use this moment to both acknowledge the things we've been doing and the support from everyone, but just really canvass quickly the last 150 years. So we've heard a lot about 1874 and through to 1882, and really the start of, I'll say, formal collaborations. The New Zealand and US linkage goes back many years before that, where individuals and companies and sort of exploration around the Pacific contacts between the peoples. But from a governmental point of view, and having spent 25 years myself working for the New Zealand Government, our Geological Survey, really interested in the history of those institutional partnerships, and that really is where we're here today in the Library of Congress and interacting with institutions in many fields of study. So as said in my introduction, that we were about 2 years ago started bringing pieces together, and what's been really exciting for me is to be able to link up in some ways unrelated parts of it, but really bring together the sort of pieces of a jigsaw puzzle about the way in which we work together, about the role of science, heritage, social sciences, the cultures, and the connections between people. And today we are celebrating, if you look at the date, it's actually 150 years plus 1 day since the transit of Venus. So we are almost on the day. We were trying for the day, but I think for various circumstances. And because the date line, actually, there was a lot of misunderstanding in some of the early writings, because on the 9th of December in 1874, it was actually the 8th of December in DC. So there is some confusion on the exact date of the transit. This photograph on the right-hand side was taken, Kelvin Tapuki is here, but this is the US ambassador, and we were privileged for him to visit the Chatham Islands in August this year. And we took the opportunity with his visit to the Chathams to launch, and he launched a book about the expedition. And I have a limited number of copies here. Many of you have them, but I can happily share them with those who haven't. And if anyone misses out, we can get additional copies. Just in that, I will acknowledge funding from the US Embassy Diplomatic Cooperation Fund that funded our work on the Chathams. Well, you also notice that they're standing beside that looks like the observation house. In fact, that is a replica of it, as built as an information kiosk on the site of the camp. The transit of Venus itself and that building and observation were in the trees in the background. But because that is up in some trees, some dense pine tree forest, and not visible from the public road, it was decided that we'd put the replica of it down in a public parking area in Port Hutt. And there is information about the transit there. So we had the official launch of that on the 150th anniversary of the arrival of the ship in that bay earlier this year, and I've got a couple of photographs. But just recapping the significance of this, so this was the first internationally coordinated astronomical event using emerging technology. So as mentioned, the transit of Venus had been observed earlier, and in the expeditions in the 18th century had telescopes and primitive clocks to try and do it. But it was, at the time, the invention of photography that allowed much more accurate readings of it, which led to the nations of the world coming together. Just to the left there is interesting is that because of the sets of photographs, it was actually the first motion picture ever created was a stacking of these photographs. So there's a little short 20-odd second movie by the French that was actually produced by stacking these transit photos. And that is now regarded as the first motion picture. Not filmed as a motion picture, but the stacking of photographs. So we have a moving image of the transit. From a New Zealand point of view, and I think this also holds for the US as well, it was really a milestone for a young nation. So New Zealand and the US were young nations back then. They hadn't been in existence a long time. And it was part of both countries' connection to the global science world. And for a small country like New Zealand, it was really important for our development of scientific institutions, but also our collaboration. And as been mentioned, the US were accompanied by expeditions from Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. So really, it was a combination of these science parties coming to our country. And once again, being part of our science establishment, much what happened this and around that time and decades following really established many of our scientific institutions that still exist to this day. And it was really the beginning of a long-term collaboration between the two countries. And the next couple of slides, I'll just highlight some of the things that have happened as that evolution of science collaboration has grown. So from 1874, this was the original and the first connection between the two countries. And this continued, as we mentioned, to 1882. And I'm just going to highlight some significant achievements. There were many and many continuous achievements in the whole time. But in 1932 was the first time the two countries came together again to discuss work around the polar region. So Antarctica of interest. And really in New Zealand and the US were part of the second International Polar Year. So what has led to a major collaboration in New Zealand US science is our polar programs and our Antarctic work really started off in 1932. Another significant vehicle for collaboration between the two countries has been the Fulbright program. And the Fulbright funds have allowed visitors, academics, scholars from New Zealand to visit the US and the US to visit New Zealand. So the Fulbright program began in 1949, really has continued to enhance the collaboration. What was very significant and has led to the development of the bases in Antarctica was the International Geophysical Year in 1959, and that was the establishment in that year of both the McMurdo Station and also Scott Base, which are only a couple of miles apart. And the US expeditions to Antarctica have headquartered their departure point from Christchurch, New Zealand, and that has continued to this day, both sea originally and then the air link from Christchurch Airport to the Antarctic bases that the US operates. So very important. In astronomy and building on the work from 1874, university and institutions in New Zealand set up at Mount John Observatory, but I believe there were also other observatories. We've got a former US astronomer in the room who was stationed in New Zealand, so we can maybe in Q&A you can share your experience there. So there's been, again, a lot of collaboration. In 1960, and this comes back to some of the work that I've been doing in my professional career, the 1960 Chilean tsunami put a tsunami across the Pacific that had major loss of life in Hawaii. It had loss of life in Japan and the Philippines. Luckily, none in New Zealand, but it was that event in 1965 set up the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center. So once again, another field of science in geohazards and geophysics have collaborated between the two countries. And that is really my personal entry into US science collaboration, was the work I've been doing since the 90s with US agencies on earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis. So that's another which is continuing. We've had a number of notable New Zealanders who've held positions in the US. I could say there's some in this room, but they can identify themselves. But we've had a long collaboration. I also say we've had a number of notable US academics have filled academic positions in New Zealand as well. So it's a bilateral exchange of both the science, but also our people. And we've seen a lot of US citizens study in our institutions, including some in this room now, and a lot of New Zealanders have studied in US institutions. So a long history of this sharing of knowledge, of people and resources. And in more recent times, in 1991 and in 2000, we've reaffirmed this spirit of collaboration with a number of bilateral science agreements on topics And the most recent one is some of the work around space science. So our Minister of Science and your equivalents have been doing a lot of work, and some of you might know that, or may not know that Rocket Lab was a small New Zealand startup company that is now principally based in California. But once again, it comes back to some early New Zealanders in the space program in the 60s. So we've had a sort of long time collaboration. And another area that I was linked to was around the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities. And that was sort of, once again, that's the not-for-profit sector also engaging. And we've seen that with the libraries, Carnegie Libraries, back in earlier times also was in New Zealand. So not just governments, but our not-for-profit and our social institutions have also connected for a long time. And just really come to now, and I just want to sort of give a sort of thank you that this event here this week is really is part of a 3-location activity, or you could say 4. So in August, we had the Festival of Science out in the Chathams, which the US Ambassador attended, and we launched the publication of our book. We had a second gathering for the 150th anniversary of the arrival of the ship, and that was marked by, once again, in the US, the photo on the left is the opening of the replica of the telescope house, and we had a group there, including representatives from the US Embassy there. Last week, and we've seen some photographs, the photo on the left is that we were hosted by the Library Company of Philadelphia on Friday. And we also had an event in November in Wellington, hosted by our Ministry of Culture and Heritage. So we've gone from the Chatham Islands Museum through to our capital in Wellington and now into the US, really just to commemorate various aspects of this and to continue the collaboration. And I thought it was fitting that, and maybe by coincidence, thanks to some funding, that the American Geophysical Union Conference, the AGU, with 23,000 people just across at the convention center this week, which allowed us an opportunity for us from some of our other research grants to be here. And we've got some posters representing this Transit of Venus work on Friday at the conference as well. So really ending a celebration really and a commemoration of this 150th from August to this week. So really at the end of this week, thank you all for attending. As I said in the opening, I hope it's the beginning of new relationships. What I'm keen to see and delighted to see is the interdisciplinary nature, bringing the sciences, the social science and the humanities together, bringing both our national institutions down to our local institutions, from the Chatham Islands Museum to Rockville, Library Company of Philadelphia, Library of Congress, Smithsonian's institutions, right through to our governments, and support from both the New Zealand and the US government to support this and the contributions they've made to sponsor a number of these events. So I might get Fenella to say the final words as the host, but thank you very much for this time. And I think there'll be an opportunity for Q&A, but maybe just the final words as part of this collaborative event from Fenella.
Thank you, David. As my colleagues and staff know, we're really big on collaboration, and it's funny how you sort of go as a scientist from being very insular and focused on one little project and realizing just the collaboration and across different fields and different institutions just really starts to bring out new knowledge. I was weirdly excited to see the image of Ross Creek, because that used to be, for those of you who don't know Dunedin, you have to run up a hill to the reservoir, and it's quite a long run up there. And then by the time you get there, it's like, oh, it's flat. And so that would be like, oh, I get to run flat for like 10 minutes before I have to go down the hill. So that was my weird 2-hour in the morning run when I was writing my PhD. It's weird what you do when you're writing PhDs. But honestly, just, yeah, really exciting to see what's coming out of collections. And I'm going to probably in a minute pass to one of my staff down the back who potentially might have an interesting connection with some work we've been doing on sound recording. So, Peter, I'm going to reach out to you in a minute. But firstly, do we have questions for our afternoon speakers and or this morning's speakers, please? And the one down here, I'll come down there and then I'll...
Hi, David. Do you think the project like the Transit of Venus is kind of maybe what started the idea of having these kind of global science years with different topics and kind of something that we do now, which is have a year where we focus on a specific topic as kind of a global scientific community?
I think that's probably a question for our historian colleagues. I was intrigued why, what would bring about an international polar year or international, I suspect that it may well have, but some here in the audience might know. Joshua, did you?
Oh, no, this is unrelated.
Okay. So I would think so, but I'm sure some others. We've seen the development of the international science unions as well in this time, so I'm not even sure exact origins of them, but I know they came later. We found in New Zealand, we had the New Zealand Institute, which came off modelled on the Royal Society in the UK, and I'm sure there are a number of academic societies in the US that all came around that early 1860s, 1880s time. We obviously go back to Philadelphia with Benjamin Franklin, which is much older. So I think the idea of science unions or knowledge unions is not new, but they've manifested in different ways and at different scales in different countries. Add to that.
I have a question for Michael. Thank you. And since our last meeting, it's very interesting to see the movements of the USS Swatara. Perhaps under the misapprehension that it had just returned to New Zealand, but as your sources alluded to, it's popped up again in December in Hobart. It's gone via Auckland. It's an interesting dynamic just seeing the movements of the Swatara.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some of those administrative receipts are there, so not only the cost of running a ship in the 19th century, but also the Leonard Waldo Journal has kind of those personal touches, like the party on board the ship, the food they ate, kind of the more human aspect. So yeah, that's a neat addition to the collection.
And a quick question for Sarah, sorry. It was quite striking to see the photo of the rangatira of the chief. I was wondering if there were either any more of that or any further details.
I think within the Rao lantern slide collections that we have relating to the Transit of Venus, there might be one or two others that seem to be images that he purchased as well. They look very similar in the format as what I showed to you, but I don't know very much about it.
Yeah, first question. Thank you very much, Michael. Everyone who presented today. Just in terms of the cost for an expedition, in terms of value in today's money, how much would that cost for the 1874, indeed the one in Auckland as well?
Oh goodness, I think I read it was $50,000 at that. Ted, do you recall that number? For 1874. Don't quote me on that number. But I think that I recall reading it was in that ballpark. Yeah.
And it's just the other second one is just for Sarah and sorry, I've forgotten your name, Kathy. Kathy, if you come across any photos, especially of Ariki from Aotearoa, there is a huge resurgence, really, of tracking down, and they're truly treasures. So keep in contact.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have some information pass on that might be useful. The main telescopes that were used for photographing the 1874 and 1882 were these 40-foot heliostats, and they used photographic plates. In front of the photographic plate in the plate holder was a piece of glass called a reticle plate that had a series of reference lines for determining the orientation of the plate. And each one of these heliostats had those plates. When it was exposed to the sun, the reference lines on that plate would be transferred onto the photographic plate. They realized that one thing they could use also is to identify where the plates were taken. And very few of the plates still exist. There's only 11 that are known to be that are at the Smithsonian, and Lick Observatory has some. They scratched in the middle of these plates a code or a name to identify where they're from. At the Naval Observatory just recently, I think in August, we discovered a number of these plates. One of them has Chatham written and scratched in the center, so it was definitely taken at Chatham. The ones for the 1882 were, the codes were kind of a little strange. For Texas, it was TX82, Florida was FL82, and there were ones that appear to say N282, and I think that is for NZ82. So the plates taken, the rectangular plates from Chatham and from Auckland from the 1882, we believe are at the observatory now.
Thank you. Questions? Other questions from the audience? I just have one question. This is sort of to Kathy and Sarah. I think it's fascinating when you find things, well, also to Michael, when you find things in your collection. I'm curious, particularly at like Rockville, is there now sort of a lot of local interest about things that are in the collection locally that start to extend out?
We would love that to happen. We would love to see that happen. And I was talking to Sarah and during the break that, you know, one of our goals is to get more of our collections online and get more finding aids out there because, you know, it happened that Louise found us through just a little, a little posting about the house being on a tour. And it was the Edwin Smith house, and that just all led to her finding us and us finding out about this this project and finding out about the transit of Venus. And I think that it's a wonderful opportunity to make more connections and nationally and internationally about what we have in our small town.
Hi. I was curious about Charles Sumner Tainter. I'm acquainted with him because in the 1880s he is introduced to Alexander Graham Bell and starts working at the Volta Lab and basically works on the experiments that lead to the recording industry. And we're actually in a collaboration with the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, digitizing some of those recordings, and so it's possible we'll be able to hear Charles's voice at some point, which would be interesting. But I'm curious, with the memoir being an interesting resource, I'm curious with his work in the exhibition in 1874, if there's anything particular that sticks out from that memoir that you'd like to recount.
I suppose it's an interesting document because it's written from a much later stage in his life, so it's much more reflective than the diaries and the letters that were written at the time. I'm not sure if anything. I mean, I haven't read it for a few months now, but it's a really interesting document because it's clearly an event that really stood out to him, and he writes a lot about how he kind of managed to make his way onto the expedition because he was interested in in the instruments, and he managed to join the company that made the instruments, and then he managed to line up on the day that the right person was visiting the factory, that he could get introduced, and then suddenly, you know, he was allowed to go and it was all go, and he kind of got assigned and he went on that kind of great adventure. And so it's nice to kind of see that, you know, he played a part in his own, I don't know, his own destiny for getting there, I guess, yeah.
Any other questions or comments from any of the speakers or anyone in the room? So I'd just like to take this opportunity, while they sneak off the stage, to thank all of our speakers today for sharing everything, and we all look forward to further collaborations and to meeting with some of our new colleagues and new knowledge that we've found from collections here and abroad. So please join me in thanking all of our speakers.